I'd like to welcome to the stage, please, to talk about AI trends in performance marketing from GamechangersSF, Phil Shpilberg. Now, there we are. Phil, thank you very much. Come on down. And so, round of applause for Phil from GamechangersSF.
All right, not a lot of switchover time, so let's go. So I'm talking about AI today as it relates to user acquisition, but I'll talk a little bit more broadly as well. Talking about AI right now is really interesting because there's so much going on. I feel like every time I do one of these, I'm sort of reinventing it because in the last month since I've given the talk last, so much changes. So in essence, like, I'm trying stuff out on you right now, so bear with me as I talk about this. So I've been in games for about 20 years. I've worked on 400 different games, mostly on the marketing side, also a little bit in production when I was at 2K Games. I come from the traditional kind of console and console and PC space before moving into mobile. I started GamechangersSF 10 years ago. GamechangersSF is advertising agency for mobile games. We've specialized only in games since we started. We started to develop a lot more technology in the last few years. A lot of our customers started to take user acquisition in-house, so we ended up kind of getting more into the tools business and providing tools to our clients for stuff that we've developed for our own use. And so the evolution has been more towards in-house UA, and so naturally we were moving more and more towards tools. And about a year ago, we started working with a company called Pixis, who had some really interesting AI technology. Like, they raised about $100 million from SoftBank on the strength of their technology. And it was a really interesting combination because the guys that founded it are in India and Bangalore. They were all gamers, right? They all kind of dropped out of college because they were playing so many games. And they sort of had to start this company to like make a living, and they've done pretty well with it. But they were dying to get into gaming, but their technology at the time was really focused around like online retail, banking, this kind of stuff. So they acquired GamechangersSF to get expertise and access to gaming. And for the last year, we've been implementing AI into gaming. And so what I'm here to talk to you about is the kind of stuff that we've seen in the last year from doing a bunch of games and converting from sort of like the old school, human managed user acquisition to incorporating a lot more AI into it, and kind of talking about our successes and failures. Like, we've seen some things work great, some things work not as great, and so I'm going to try to sum up what I've seen. And what if you see this a month from now, it's probably going to change because we're seeing stuff all the time. So that's kind of the background. I feel like no discussion of AI is complete if you don't start at chess, because I feel like this is where like engineering nerds try to figure out if we can get computers to think more like people, and there's nothing better than pitting it against like a chess champion, right? So it really mimics how things have developed in AI. Back in '97, I remember this, I was like graduating college, Deep Blue was competing with Kasparov, who was the chess champion at the time, and they played a few times and he kind of won easily. But this was like a turning point. In '97, the machine beat him, and it sort of like never turned back. But the way it happened was really interesting. The way that Deep Blue was programmed, IBM got a bunch of chess masters, they had him advise, and they basically loaded it with a bunch of information, opening database, closed data, end games, bunch of grandmaster games, and it basically thought like a human. It that's the way you train a grandmaster. You like memorize all these classic games, and then you look at a situation and go, has this happened before? If not, you start calculating. And so this AI sort of calculated its way to it, and kind of brute force, it could beat a chess champion. That was then. Today, it's completely different. The top computer programs, what they do is, they don't know anything about chess except the rules, right? They just learn the rules, and then they play themselves for about like 10 hours. And then they get so strong through doing that, playing billions of games and combinations, that they crush everything. So this is a really interesting kind of evolution, because this is kind of what happened in UA, right? Initially, the AI was just, it really wasn't, right? It was rules-based. Like, if the CPI does this, shut it down, like kind of guardrails, right? And then you built in rules that sort of thought like humans. Well, today, it doesn't work like that. It's the next generation of AI. You basically tell it your goals, and you give it a bunch of freedom, right? Like, you still set some guardrails. You don't want to spend, like, $10 million before it's optimized, all this kind of stuff. But the guardrails are getting, like, smaller and smaller. And the more decision-making power that the AI has, the more it comes up with sort of interesting solutions. Like, if you watch this AI play chess, like, if you want to go on YouTube and watch AlphaZero play chess, it'll baffle you if you know anything about chess at first. You're like, it's not doing anything that a human would do, and yet it's beating humans and kind of breaking all this chess theory that we came up with for 300 years. Well, it turns out that we simplify things to a great extent as humans, right? We are like, these are some rules and things like that. When AI is not bound by that, it actually comes up with really interesting solutions. So that's kind of the background, right? And so what's happened for us is we've done about 400 plus game launches over the last 10 years. And so before the acquisition by Pixis, we were a very traditional kind of marketing shop with a bunch of technology that we developed to kind of like create ads. We have Multivid, which is a really interesting multivariate ad creation and testing platform, but we were largely doing things the traditional way. We did, you know, creative services, marketing strategy, user acquisition, data science, all that stuff. About 12 years ago, we got access to this really interesting AI technology from Pixis, and we started deploying it. So the first, you know, really interesting thing that I want to tell you before we get into this is we realized that gaming is pretty advanced when it comes to user acquisition. These guys were getting ridiculous results in like finance and online shopping. They were like, oh, we've improved ROI, ROAS 60, 70%. Tell your clients that's what's going to happen. Turned out that the reason that was happening is a lot of those companies were running their stuff pretty badly, right? They were throwing in, it's Facebook, throw some interns on it, right? Or they would just let stuff run and never make any changes until it just became terrible. Well, that turned out that's not the way things work in gaming. People are actually pretty good at this, and they really focus on it. So we do see ROAS improvement, but it's nowhere. If you saw this presentation a year ago, you would see like 50, 60%. That was outside of gaming. In gaming, 10, 15, 20% is a pretty good result. So with that in mind, what I want you to take away from today, like if you don't walk away with anything else, these are the three things I really want you to know that I've taken away from AI in the last year. Like you really should be experimenting with some sort of AI right now in your user acquisition. I'm not saying turn it all over. I'm not saying even maybe give it most of the dollars, but you really need to start like playing with this and using these tools because like the smartest marketers out there are doing it, and you're competing. Like we're all competing for the same impressions and all this stuff. So definitely start messing around with it and start understanding like what it looks like. The other thing that I'm finding is our team has actually grown significantly since we started implementing AI, but what we do right now is much different than what we did a year ago. AI, like, yes, it can get better results, but it's sort of the day-to-day, like, do I spend money here or there? Which channels do I choose? It does it much better than people do it because it's kind of ruthless calculating arbitrage, right? And you don't really want people doing that. What you want your people doing is thinking, kind of like getting back to the basics of marketing, like what should our strategy be? What do we want to tell people about our game? What should the creative look like? What influencers do we want to work with? What user-generated content do we want to encourage? What new emerging channels are there? What are the trends? They have more time to go to conferences and learn stuff. Like that's actually what AI, I think a lot of the benefit of AI is that it frees you up from the really mundane parts of user acquisition. And the other thing is, we are really like just taking baby steps right now. I'm gonna give you where I think some of this stuff is going from what I've seen, and it's it's pretty exciting. It's gonna be pretty interesting for the next couple of years. So first of all, like this is what I told you. It really is kind of a no-brainer these days to try some kind of AI. Like you don't have to install SDKs anymore. It's pretty codeless at this point. So if you wanted to work with Pixis, or I imagine one of our competitors, you could just sort of plug this in, right? It runs off attribution. It's in our case, it's a plug-in to the browser that just creates a new column in your ad groups, puts stuff in an AI group. You tell it what the goal of that group is, right? And it'll try to achieve it. Pretty straightforward. We generally see a ROAS improvement. It's not always dramatic, as I said, but generally it'll find a ROAS improvement. But the biggest thing I'm finding is it saves a lot of time and resources. It kind of takes away the mundane work. Like, you know, you realize sometimes when you lead UA teams that, like, sometimes they don't look at stuff in a long time when they should look at stuff. AI doesn't take breaks. It doesn't, like, need weekends. It could sort of, you know, look at stuff all the time. So just kind of what does AI look like today? Like, I'll tell you what Pixis AI stack looks like, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. We currently have 3 modules that run on 4 channels. Performance AI is like the bid and budget management. It'll decide like which campaigns, which geos, which platforms, which networks should get the spend, and what you should be bidding to the extent that that's the way the network works, right? What should you be bidding? And it's pretty efficient. We get a pretty good boost with this. The targeting AI is a really interesting one. In channels like, obviously not Google, but other channels where you have a lot of targeting options, it'll figure out like behavioral data, and it'll create new audiences, right? This is one of the more challenging things to do, to keep coming up with new audiences. And finally, creative AI, this is the one that's like the most potential in the future, right, with generative AI. But generative AI in games isn't really far along yet, because first of all, there's a whole bunch of legal issues that have to get sorted out, right? You can't, like, if you create something on the, you know, Mid-Journey, can you put it in an ad? Murky, right? But the bigger problem is it doesn't really look like your game, and so that's sort of a problem right now. And then finally, like, generative AI is making big strides in static, you know, in like graphics, but video we're still pretty far off. And then it has to look like your game again. So we're I think like a year away from really having generative AI that can make real like impressive ads. But we can generate copy. Like, it's great for that. It's kind of like a Chat GPT type copy generator where we could load in everything that you've done and all the things that work, and then we can come up with new copies. So it's starting to do that. It's starting to rotate creative. Like, it has a library. It knows when creative is starting to get kind of stale, and it rotates in new stuff. And it'll turn it off if it's not doing well. Like, all that stuff is you can now do with AI. But when we think of creative AI, I think we're thinking of generative AI, right? So finding new audiences is pretty amazing. Like, one of our early clients, we started running targeting AI, and they kept telling us, well, that's not our audience. We're like, it kind of is your audience, but like, this is the whole point. It finds non-obvious audiences, like the kind of overlap with other audiences. We get less targeting options now, but it's really important to constantly be creating new audiences and targeting them. Well, this AI can create sort of micro audiences, test, and then move budget around to the best performing audiences. That's a pretty like good application of AI today. And then, like, I get a lot of questions about what should people be doing? Like, are we going to lose all these UA jobs? You know, it's pretty clear that AI will do certain things better, like do calculations. It lacks bias on audiences, things like this. It's not, you know, even though it can make creative, it's not creative, right? It won't think about things that it's never seen before. That's where people are really good. It won't tell you what the strategy for your game should be. So marketers, it's funny, like, a lot of old things are new again. Like, marketing mix analysis is kind of coming back around, and people who haven't been in marketing for a long time, it feels really new. Well, you know, that thing's like 50 years old. So, and it's a great tool, but it just wasn't being used when we had this kind of straightforward performance marketing stuff that we were doing, and we had all these great targeting options. So that's like the stuff that our UA people should be looking at. What are these classic tools or new tools that we should be implementing instead of kind of calculating where your budget should be spent? So I think this is where human work is really interesting, right? So better strategy, try new channels, try new creative on those channels, work with creators, and, you know, provide better strategy. That's where I think the future for humans is. So what does AI look like when you're running it? So this is like a month in the life of AI for a typical game. So 10 to 20% ROAS improvement is what we can expect when we plug in AI. It takes maybe 60 to 90 days to get to that point, but it's pretty consistent, and it'll kind of it'll stabilize better than what most people can do on those channels that I showed you, which is, I don't think I talked about it, but for us, it's Facebook, Google, Apple Search, and TikTok, and those are just like API channels where you can make real-time decisions based on data coming in. So, you know, AI could analyze an incredible number of data points that people just would not be able to do. I think like in this particular game, it saved over 100 hours of human work. So that's, you know, again, like what can you do with 100 hours that you didn't have before? This is like the interesting part. Interestingly, I looked at this, it recommended 20,000 actions. The way the AI works is once you kind of, you know, you go through like a training period and then you look at its recommendations and you could say yes, no. After you kind of hone it in, after everything over 80% confidence interval, when it's like I'm 80% confident this is going to make this change is going to improve whatever your goal is, ROAS, then it'll make the decision. So it'll suggest 20,000 actions. It'll take like a smaller percentage of them, few hundred actions, but that's the way it works. It kind of, and you could see that the other interesting thing is there's a lot of black box AI out there, like Facebook and Google won't show you what's happening when they make these decisions. When you have this is meant to be on your side, right? So when it's making decisions, you could actually see what it's thinking and why. And that's one of the things I like best about having kind of AI on the advertiser side, is when you see like a recommendation, you can see what's behind it. And you know, in some cases you could override it, you could tweak the system, but you see its brains. It's not just doing stuff. So, okay, what today, and when I make these slides, it's always a little dangerous because it's possible that in the last few weeks, like you can do something new, but broadly what I'm seeing today, what can AI do in user acquisition? It could automate bid and budget and budget allocation fairly well among the channels where it works. It does a good job finding new audiences. It does a great job generating copy, and it does a decent job generating images. Like if you're looking at the stuff I have in this presentation, you'll get an idea, right? Today, what AI can't really do is automate all channels, right? So there are still a bunch of channels that like you don't have an API into them. And so the best you could do is like maybe, you know, download data, put it in the AI and have it give you recommendations, but that's still not an automated kind of AI thing, and that's going to take a little while. As I mentioned, they can't really generate video ads for games. If somebody can, tell me about it, but you know, I've seen early experiments, and I think we're still a year or two or more away from being able to like plug in and make generative video ads for games. I think that's coming, but I don't think it's there yet. The other thing is self-iterating uncreative. So we have a system called Multivid where we do this, but it's not automated, right? So what I envision one day, and I'll give you like what I think is coming next, but I think there's a lot to be done with AI that basically looks at performance of ads, understands why an ad's working, and then makes changes on the fly and improves performance in that way. So, that kind of brings me nicely into what I think is coming, because I think this is the really interesting part of what do we think is going to happen in the next year or two. So one thing we waste an incredible amount of time and money on is testing creative. So we make a bunch of ads, and you'll hear things like 1 out of 20 ads work, 1 out of whatever. Not all ads work, right? And we have to spend money testing these ads to see which ones will work. Well, we're going to create, you know, we're on the verge of seeing basically AI personas that start to mimic the way people behave, and we'll be able to create these AI personas and feed ads in, and then figure out which ones are going to work. And the way this training happens is you just sort of do it side by side, right? You keep running ads in like the channels you are spending money, and then feeding the results into AI. I think eventually when we get really good at like segmenting things, it'll be able to tell us which of our ads are going to perform best. So we're going to stop wasting a bunch of money testing these ads. Okay, this is the one I'm really excited about. If you've ever worked with a development team, like this is back from my console days, and you try to get assets like video while they're making the ad, you need to make a trailer for E3, it used to be. They're working on this game, and they're like, do you want us to finish this game, or do you need like this trailer? It's difficult, right, getting stuff out of games. And then at the same time, there's a lot of data inside games about what are actually players engaging in. What are those moments, like those big moments that you could share in ads? Well, I think we're going to be able to plug in AI into game engines and feed like data about what's happening, and then extract like the most interesting pieces of that game and be able to use it in advertising without having to bother the developers who are rightfully working really hard on making that game great. I think that's going to be really interesting when we could start like figuring out exactly what in the game works and feeding that into the marketing. I think that'll be one of the more interesting developments in the next few years. On the really fun side of things, deep fakes, I think, are going to become bigger and bigger, but not in the way that, like, people are warning us about, right? I think there'll actually be really interesting endorsements and things like that, which will be able to happen with the approval of, like, personalities, but without necessarily their participation. It's really interesting. Like, I've been talking to some friends that are in the VC community, and they're experimenting with some of this, like producing content. Like, there's some people that are very famous and they have very busy schedules and they want to do a podcast. They would love to do a podcast. But sitting down and recording a podcast takes a lot of time. And, you know, some mornings you're not into it, like, you're not feeling it. You know, deepfake AI, feed, you know, 10,000 hours of a person speaking, it could crank out that podcast and it'll sound great. They'll be excited every time. And that's going to have a pretty big implication in marketing, right? It'll make our life, I think, easier in some ways, harder in some other ways, but it'll be an interesting world we're living in with the deepfake stuff. It's getting really good. It's getting extremely good. So the final one, I think, is it is sort of mundane, but it's interesting. Like, our multi-vid technology today, every ad we create a bunch of variations. Because what happens is, like, traditional A/B testing, you would usually have completely different ad concepts. You'd have, like, you know, one kind of ad that had one message and then another that had another message. But we started to notice when we were running these ads is actually a lot of the small creative decisions that didn't have to do with messaging, but simply what you put first, or, like, which character from the game you used, or which piece of gameplay you used, had tremendous effect on the way the ad performed. Because we live in this world where people are scrolling through their feed and they decide in the first 2 or 3 seconds if they're going to actually watch this thing. So what we put there became incredibly important, and it was kind of separate from the message. It was more about, like, visual novelty, like what would get people to stop scrolling. So we started to create every ad with a bunch of variations to make sure that not only was our messaging correct, but the creative choices we made to get people's attention were correct. Well, that's, like, pretty time-consuming and expensive, and what I was talking about with real-time kind of being able to change these ads is I think we'll be able to, like, load in a bunch of assets and an ad will start running and you'll start getting feedback, and the AI could actually make adjustments to that ad as it runs until it starts performing better. Or it'll just, like, turn it off, like it's not going to work. But that's going to be pretty interesting, and we are like experimenting with this, but the automation of it's going to be, you know, it's when we get the generative AI that could actually make the videos, this is going to be a really interesting part of that. So I don't know if you figured this out, but every single image in this was created by AI. Like, no artist touched this. It's probably the nicest presentation I've ever had, and like this is not what my artists are spending time doing. They're making ads. So that's pretty cool, I think, you know. So anyway, the 3 takeaways that I want you to walk away with again is AI is, like, in the very early form right now, but it's really interesting. So definitely start experimenting with it. Humans do some really interesting stuff that we should get back to doing, like figuring out classic marketing and how it applies here, and let the AI do the heavy math stuff. And yeah, this is just the pre-party. I think it's going to get pretty interesting in the next few years. I'm pretty excited. All right, thank you guys.